Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this edition of 30 on Thursdays, our bi-weekly SharePoint webinar series. Go ahead and get started with some housekeeping as people continue to join the webinar. For those of you joining for the first time, 30 on Thursdays, as I mentioned, is a bi-weekly 30-minute webinar series that we've been doing about 2 years now, 2.5 years now, on anything and everything related to SharePoint. Our next webinar is coming up 2 weeks from today on October 10th, where we're going to talk about leveraging rich media and video in SharePoint. And you can get the full schedule of all of our upcoming webinars at sharepoint.protiviti.com/webinars. Today's session is being recorded, so if you do need to drop off early for some reason, we'll have this recording posted to our website usually by early tomorrow. We have a full archive of the past sessions that we've recorded at sharepoint.protiviti.com/archive-webinars. And during today's session, we'd ask if you have any questions for Liam as he's going through the material today to go ahead and use that question window over on the right, over the chat window. And we'll go ahead and save all the questions till the end. We'll leave a little bit of time to go through any questions you might have. So some other free education opportunities we have coming up. You can actually see us face-to-face. We're doing a series of roundtables around the country on what is new in SharePoint 2013. I think these are typically breakfast sessions. We've got some come up. You can see we have Tampa, Kansas City, DC, Chicago, Charlotte, and Atlanta all coming up. And you can get more information on those at sharepoint.protiviti.com/roundtables. And go ahead and register for those if there's one in your area and you're interested in learning more about SharePoint 2013. Some other education opportunities. These are online training classes, longer format length and actually full training classes. The entire calendar is available on our website, sharepoint.protiviti.com/online-classes. And with that, we'll go ahead and get into today's session, which is Lock It Down, Securing Your SharePoint Environment. Liam Cleary, SharePoint MVP, and from Protiviti is going to be the presenter. I'm Steve Witt. I act as moderator, and if you use the chat window or question window, I'll be the person responding. So with that, we'll jump into today's session. I'm going to go ahead and turn over control to Liam. Say hello, Liam.
Hello.
There you go.
Can you see my screen?
I can. Looks great.
Okay, cool. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming to this 30-minute session. What I wanted to do was give you a little bit of background of kind of the reason for talking about things like this to do with locking down SharePoint and security. As a whole, those of you will have seen the news over the past year will have seen that there's many events that have taken place where hackers have gained access to content on various platforms and published content that shouldn't be available to everybody. And so we live in a world where looking after our environments, whether they're SharePoint or not, should be paramount in what we do. I think historically that we've kind of just assumed that everything is secure and that we can publish things to the internet and no one's going to do anything. Because why would they try and connect to your SharePoint environment? Why would somebody try to access your content? What about those internal employees? So let's talk about these hackers. The hackers are kind of broken down. So first off, if we look, excuse me, we have what I would class as the veteran hackers. Now notice that there's a few there. We have Anonymous, we have the Syrian army, we have the Iranian army, and of course we also, based on the latest news articles that are taking place, we have the NSA and GCHQ, because realistically every government agency has sets of people that are hopefully protecting secrets and content that we have in the world at the government by doing similar things that hackers would do. Hackers as a whole, these are the professional people. These are the ones that when a new device comes out or a new application comes out, these are the people that are very clever and smart and will find ways of breaking into that environment. So these are the people we need to be concerned about. But we also need to be concerned about these people also. These are employees. Taking the two previous examples that took place this year, obviously you have the WikiLeaks with Manning, who was an employee, and then we have the issue with Snowden, and he was also an employee. So we have to remember that potentially a disgruntled employee or just a regular employee could potentially be a hacker. And if we look at what a hacker would be, it's somebody that would compromise an environment or gain access to something that they should not have access to. We also have these guys, developers. Developers technically could be classed as hackers. They always like to work around things. They may script around something to bypass security. You all know this. You all know the scenario. Some custom application gets built and it gets deployed into the environment, and then you find that that application doesn't run in a least privileged configuration because they required extra level of security or they bypassed the security in order for that to work. And then, of course, these guys, administrators, I put these on there because they can be good administrators and they could be bad administrators. These are the guys that own the security infrastructure. And so these people could ultimately be the worst kind of hackers because they already have access to those things. If we drill down to the Snowden story, he was an administrator. He had levels of permission and access. So when he took the documents and published them, they were documents that he shouldn't really have had, but his system administrator credentials allowed him access to that. So that's an interesting point when we look at SharePoint about securing to the objects that we actually need permission to. So we're obviously here to talk about SharePoint, so let's talk about EntryPoints. SharePoint is just a website. It's just a .NET application like anything else that you could write yourself. Obviously you need a lot more developers and a lot more money like Microsoft, but you could write something like SharePoint. And obviously web applications inherently have access points that people need to get to. So for example, it could be web services, it could be the .NET pages, it could be some custom DLL components, it could be something. Now SharePoint has what we call SharePoint brute force URLs that everyone who works with SharePoint slowly gets to know. So for example, there's a list now. These are some of the lists. Notice that the underscore layouts pages. These are entry points, and these are the administration entry points that you would try to get to. So for example, you may know underscore layouts / settings.aspx. Now if I'm going to try and compromise a SharePoint environment, I'm going to have done some research to find out about these entry points. And for example, getting access to settings.aspx, let's say you misconfigured your environment and I could get to that, even not being logged in, or I could compromise credentials to get there. I could make lots of changes to your SharePoint environment. Then of course we have access to lists. I could get access to all items. We could also have access to the catalogs where the master pages are stored. I could access the site master page changer and change the master page on your site. I could access the help pages. I could access the mobile list page. This is quite a useful one. If you're testing access to your site from outside, no one seems to test that page because inherently that page does require authentication. However, if your SharePoint environment is misconfigured, that mobile list.aspx page will render me all of the lists in the site as an anonymous user. And of course the top one there is the famous one, the view lsts.aspx. That's the all site content page. So that means anything that's in your site, I can traverse that as an anonymous user. Of course we can try and get to the authentication pages. We could get to navigation and theme pages. We could access any of the user group information, the users, the roles, the people picker, the user disk for user enumeration. I could access any of the web part preview pages, and I could also dynamically access the web services directly. So you'll see there's quite a lot of entry points that SharePoint itself uses, but also is required as far as accessing SharePoint content. And me as a potential hacker, I suppose, would know to start trawling through these list of brute force URLs to find out which ones are valid, which ones are available, which ones, when I try to connect to them, which ones give me 404s or give me 200, which means it's okay to get to it. So this is my first entry point. That's what I'm going to look for. Now we can also do a different approach. We can use the search engines to do hacking. So Google and Bing are well known for being able to do search queries and return websites based on certain sets of criteria. Now, for example, we could use Google and we could do in URL : and pass in the all site content page. And that would allow me to see SharePoint sites that are exposing the view lsts.aspx page or the all site content page, potentially anonymously, or at least Google at some point has managed to gain access to that page and crawled that page. I could do the same in Bing. I could use in stream set URL and do the same syntax. Now, once I've done a search and I've found a site, so let's say we were using, SharePoint.helloitsliam.com, for example, and we found that it was exposing content, my next task is to load something like Nmap. And Nmap will allow me to do port scans against that SharePoint environment, or the URL, or the servers, whatever access point I get. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ping the URL, it's going to give me an IP address, and then I'm going to do an Nmap scan. And what am I looking for? I'm looking for things like this. I'm looking for central administration ports, I'm looking for service application ports, I'm looking for web services, I'm looking for ports that are not port 80 and port 443, which would be HTTP and HTTPS. So I'm also looking for one that I don't write here, which is remote desktop. I have been quite surprised the amount of SharePoint environments that are exposing content to the internet that also allow remote desktop to the servers. Now, obviously, you can't just break a remote desktop session. You would need to use tools to go into that with password files. But it begs the question of why are these ports available to the internet? So this is a good test against your own SharePoint environment to see what ports may be open. Now, if I know that a SharePoint site is exposing content, then maybe it's vulnerable to cross-site scripting. In SharePoint 2010 and 2007, there was a cross-site scripting attack that you could do against the calendar pages. Now, obviously, my syntax here just pops up an alert box. But for those who are listening, if you have 2010 or 2007, I suggest that you take this syntax and test it on your SharePoint environment. And if you get the alert box, then that means that your SharePoint environment is vulnerable to cross-site scripting attacks. There are fixes for this on the Microsoft site. But it is one option that we can use, because the logic behind a cross-site scripting attack is that I can send you to a URL, I can have you go there, and I can inject something into the page. So a real-world example would be you get an email because I've compromised and I can send emails to you. You get an email that has a link to your valid SharePoint site, but it's cleverly crafted so that when you click that link, it loads your SharePoint site, but it calls JavaScript that will then inject, for example, a username and password box into the page, which means you're going to put credentials into that box because you think that you should need to, and then I can harvest those credentials. Now, obviously, most modern browsers will also protect against that, but this is something that you may want to check in your environment. SharePoint also has components that reside in the _VTI_bin directory. One of those is the spdisco file, and this ASPX page allows me to see the web service URLs, the exact URL, so your URL /VT_bin/sites.asmx or users.asmx. It gives me the list in an XML structure of what those URLs will be. Now, I can also access the user dist page. The user dist page you may have seen before. You may have gone into SharePoint and clicked on a name, and it's taken you to this weird SharePoint page that just presents what your login credential is, your email address, phone numbers, not necessarily your user profile, but other information that's stored in the user info list in SharePoint. I can write code that would do a user enumeration if this was being exposed externally. We can access the VTI_imp file, which is generated that shows front page extensions, the RPC locations, and if we're using, for example, using a Linux box or something else, we can actually attack the front page extensions and call queries into SharePoint. For example, finding out the version of SharePoint. You know, is it version 14 for 2010? Is it 15 for 2013? Now, there are instances where in SharePoint, two web service methods can be called anonymously. One of those is search principles, and one of those is get all user collections from web. Search principles allows me to pass syntax excuse me, and retrieve XML data of all the users that belong in that SharePoint site. The same goes for the get all user collections. Also be aware that some third-party components may also have vulnerabilities in them. So for example, there's a specific one that's available that when you access this specific link, if you have it, it will actually present your email address and your SIP address and your name to an anonymous user. So this is something that you need to check. Look at the third-party components that you have, because they may be inadvertently exposing data to people outside of your SharePoint site. And then of course we can use something called Shodan, which is a website. I'm not going to show you that today because that site is currently down due to issues with their ISP. But Shodan searching allows me to look for authenticate tags and Microsoft SharePoint team services and bring back SharePoint sites that this separate search engine is crawling anything that's connected to the internet, from a device perspective to servers to web servers. And so Shodan HQ, as it's called, allows you to query that information and then use that as the start to work through the process of how to access the content. Now, one of the things that took place recently was when the military guy Manning went on and downloaded 250,000 documents from SharePoint and posted those on WikiLeaks. Now, the way that he was able to do that was he used a free tool called WGET. Now, WGET is a very simple syntax. So I've posted here a little syntax of what that would be. It's a simple tool that allows you to download content. Now, of course, what I was able to do with this one is call WGET, tell it to look for specific PDFs, disable any checks for SSL, because obviously we think that SSL is inherently secure, and so we put an SSL certificate on our SharePoint site, but then we also allow anonymous access, which kind of defeats the point of having SSL to make it secure. So I can actually tell it, well, if it's got an SSL certificate, WGET's going to break, but if I just use no check certificate, then it will continue. And I can then access the all items page, which here's a screenshot. This is from a live website, so hence the red hack marks, so you don't know where it is. And so it's gone down, and I'm actually going to run the syntax and say, basically get me all the PDFs and spit them out to a directory. And it goes and runs this command, and you'll see at the bottom it's got 1% and works its way through, and it will download all of the documents in a complete folder structure. And I then end up with this folder structure at the bottom. So notice it says shared documents, because that will be the documents folder, forms, and then all of the content. So by using a simple one-line script, I can target a specific SharePoint site. Now bear in mind, I may not get any content that would be useful. But remember that hackers are not just out to compromise your system. They're looking for information that can be used for a social engineering attack. A social engineering attack can be more dangerous than an actual hack and compromise attack, because it means that I'm capturing information, anonymously perhaps, about you as an organization or even you as an individual that I can then use in an attack that might be, I call you on the phone, I validate information that only your organization would know about you because I managed to compromise your SharePoint environment. So we have to think a little bit differently now about the attack surface of SharePoint. We're not just looking at, well, can they break through the firewall? What content is being exposed inadvertently, externally? Has the permissions been misconfigured? Why do we have anonymous access to places like this? Now, another attack that can be used for social engineering is the enumeration. So I'm going to use PowerShell to do enumeration at this point. So you'll see I wrote a little function that's called iterate pages. It basically passes a URL, a starting number, and an ending number, and then goes and captures the URL of the page and stores it to a location. So I'm going to run this against the user disk page. So I'm going to call iterate pages. Here's my URL. I'm going to pass it a number 1 and go all the way to 1,000. And what this is going to do, this is going to hit the user disk page, which has information about you. So for example, I ran this earlier and I have 10 files. And you'll notice they're various sizes because the user info table stores various information about you from your Active Directory or your authentication mechanism. So if I choose one of them and open number 1, you'll notice that what I'm actually getting is the raw HTML of that page. And then, of course, I can do a search in that text for email, because remember, email addresses are quite valuable. I can sell email addresses to organizations who would want to email you things. Or we could use valid corporate email addresses to sign up for all kinds of things. So this is valuable information. So I can go in and look in the HTML, and sure enough, if I do a search in one of those pages that I downloaded, I get the administrator at whatever that organization might be, as well as other details like phone numbers. I may even get the user login, which would be domain/user account. Now just think that through for a second. You're inadvertently exposing the user this page. I want to do a social engineering attack. I'm going to grab the HTML content. I'm going to look at your user credentials. That means I'm 50% there in trying to access with a valid user account. And I could then do a social engineering attack. I could call you on the phone because I have all this information that only internal people would know, and I could then validate that I was a potential IT admin trying to fix some issue that we may have had. So, in order for us to understand how to fix some of those issues, we also need to understand how SharePoint talks across the server farm. So if we take SharePoint 2013 as the example, I have a series of servers that run backwards and forwards. So I have a web server, I have some App Fabric caching servers, I have some AD servers, I have all the servers that would make up a SharePoint farm. And what we can see is that each of the servers communicate across all of these ports. So for example, at the web server end, you're going to be accessing content using port 80 or 443, which will be SSL. But then internally, the servers are going to communicate between all of these ports. So you're actually going to end up with this, where SharePoint is chatting between everything. But we also get the other way around. All of the servers literally communicate with each other. And that's one of the issues that we find with SharePoint, is that it's very chatty and it's very complicated often to control the traffic that goes between. So how do we fix that? Well, we look at securing a topology, and we pick a topology design that will allow us to do that. So if we start from the back inwards, I'm going to have my Active Directory, I'm going to have my email system, I'm going to have my SQL servers, I'm going to have my application servers, and I'm going to have my web servers. And what am I going to do? I'm going to do what everybody does. Everybody publishes SharePoint, they stick a firewall in front of it, put it over HTTP or HTTPS, and then they walk away from it, and it's done. It's very rare that anybody goes any further unless they have a mandated security policy. And so that's a great design. You have one entry point through a firewall that can be inspected and controlled. But what about the traffic that goes in between? Well, of course, we could do this. We could do this and we could do this. And that would give us a secure topology. Now, bear in mind, if we were doing a SharePoint brute force attack, going in using the URLs, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many firewalls you have, because I'm accessing content on a valid port. Now, if we just pop to my Google window for a second, I'm going to do, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to just do this syntax here. So you'll notice that this is running live in Google, so we aren't going to hack anything, but this gives you an idea of syntax that you can run. So I've just ran in URL, and I've prefixed the website using gov and looking for the all site content page. And of course, then we get a series of websites. And some of these you may recognize, some of them you may not. Division of Cancer Biology, for example. Now, we could change this, and we could do this. We could go with military sites, and there's a few of them, or we could just go with regular.com websites. And you can see that there are lots and lots and lots of websites that show up in this Google, which means that they've been indexed by Google and are exposing content. Now, we could do other things like this. So I could do, oh, I got my syntax. People's blocked that one today. I can use syntax to search for specific lists. So I could use in URL and do the same thing again. Or what I could do is do the layouts one, and then I could do userdist.asdx, and I could do that one. And this will allow me to see specific sites. So for example, I could pick this site here. This site's going to load. And this is what I should see. You should see the website asking you for authentication at this point. So what this shows to me is that the SharePoint site was exposing information previously, but then somebody fixed that issue. Now if we go to this one, we can go to different websites, and you can test and go through and see if these sites load pages and content. Another one again, we're going through ADFS authentication. This is great. Now you can run these URLs directly against your own site. Now this one here, for example, this one does load, and this shows information. So what I'm able to do is I could type in ID of 10, and it would continue to load. I could do 11, and you can see that it will go backwards and forwards, and I can see information as anonymous user. You'll see this is the translation. Obviously it's guest, which for guest. So that means I can see what the name of the domain might be, and I can then run code accordingly. So if I went to my PowerShell command, you'll see I've got my get web page function, and there's my iterate pages. So I'm just going to run my code quickly, just so I have the messages. And I'm going to do iterate pages, and then what we'll do is we'll take this URL, which is here. I'm just going to open Notepad and just construct the URL a little bit differently. I don't need all that extra. And that's my URL that I'm now going to paste into my PowerShell, which will go here. I'm going to start at 1, and I'll go to 20. So that means I can now run that, and it's going to go ahead, and you'll see it's now breaking out text files. And if I go, you'll see my text files will be rendering inside this window, and we can keep them loading. While that's doing that, I'm going to open one of the pages, and if we do a search for email, now obviously you have to skip through all the stuff, so this one doesn't have any content in, but if I go to this one and do email, you'll see it's brought me down to some content, and there's my field name, which we looked at earlier, and then of course we have the administrator account. So this is completely real. You can test this against your own SharePoint environment. If you have a public-facing environment, you can test that syntax to see if that content is available. Now you can also do other tests. You can use, remember we did the WGET script? So we can take, for example, a WGET script that's here. I can then paste that syntax in there, and this is going to go ahead and it will start downloading content. And what will happen is, when I go into here, you'll see that my orders and policies and PDF documents are now downloading dynamically to the site, very simply as an anonymous user. Now, of course, the question might be, are you supposed to be able to access that anonymously? Well, maybe you are, maybe you aren't. But what we tend to find is that most instances where documents are available anonymously, it's normally because the SharePoint environment was configured incorrectly in the first place. For example, you may have started with a team site template, then you realized that you wanted publishing enabled, so you enabled publishing, which is great, but one of the things that that doesn't do is enable the view form pages lockdown feature, which controls access to all of those pages that we just went through. It would block access to that. And so that's something that you need to look at as far as that. So how do we secure what we just did? Well, the first thing to do is we're going to start all the way at the back, and we're going to do block standard SQL Server ports. Everybody in the world knows that SQL runs on 1433 and 1434. Every hacker tool that you download that scans for that knows exactly what to look for. Maybe configure your SQL instances to listen on non-standard ports. Now obviously that's a bit more complicated because of course you may have other applications that might need to talk to SQL and you may need to do that. But if you're doing best practice, your SQL servers would be solely dedicated to that. Use SQL aliases. That's always a good start. That's the best practice anyway, because you'll have an alias on the machine and then the alias will point to the SQL server. That's also good for redundancy. Use SQL encryption. We could use TDE on the content databases. So even if I was able to compromise, I would not be able to restore that database without the private keys from the encryption. Also implement server firewalls. The amount of times that I see the Windows Server firewall switched off, it should stay on and policies should be created. Use the netsh or use the PowerShell equivalent commands to open the specific ports that you need to communicate between the servers and block everything else. Run the best practice security analyzer. Run that process. That will check your security footprint on the servers. Use the hardening guide, that should say server, sorry, hardening guidance that's from Microsoft. They have documentation for hardening the OSs. And if you work in government organizations or others, then of course you may follow the sticks. You may have other documentation for securing that. Use group policies. That's what they're there for. Control service account permissions. Don't make all the service accounts administrators. Control that by a group policy. Only open required ports. If you don't need to have the ports open, then why are you opening them in the first place? Don't just blanket trust the traffic that goes between. Use hardware and software firewalls at the perimeter or between each layer. SSL encryption at the front end. SSL inspection solutions. There are many out there that you can use to put in the front and control the access in and out and inspect all the traffic. And offload authentication. I'm a great advocate of offloading authentication. So something does the authentication before you actually get to the SharePoint server. So what are some things that you can do? Ensure the use of the form pages lockdown feature. If you have a SharePoint environment, and go and check, you can run the STS ADM commands or PowerShell commands to see if it's enabled. If it's not, maybe it's time to enable it and those pages will disappear and not be available to be accessed via anonymous users if your site is available outside. Alternatively, you can make web config changes and do location path settings to block down specific pages. Monitor access to your SharePoint environment. Proactively monitor access to the SharePoint environment. Those WGET commands that I just ran would not have shown up as anything special. The only way that I would know that it was a WGET script would be the speed with which it was downloading the content from the site. Now, I could fix that as a potential hacker by putting timeouts in between, but as a hacker, I really want stuff now. So you could see that on the firewall. You could see fast access. Control who can delete the logs and the event logs and the SharePoint logs. This includes administrators. SharePoint doesn't have forensic capabilities, so you need to control who can delete things. You know, if you have a would-be administrator who's potentially disgruntled, or maybe he may be a hacker, he could be taking content and deleting things without you even knowing, because the logs never say anything. Check for SQL injection vulnerabilities, brute force password attacks, and cross-site scripting. SharePoint itself is not susceptible to a SQL injection attack. It becomes vulnerable based on other bits and pieces, other code, other applications being installed into SharePoint that would require that level of authentication. So always validate. Control your search result access. This happened a while back last year. The Mississippi National Guard, they cross-injected search results and exposed personnel data on their public-facing site. So be careful how you control and segment the search results. If you have external-facing sites and internal on the same farm, control how they go. Excuse me. Pen test your SharePoint site. If it's internal, you can choose. If it's external, I would almost say you have no choice, that you need to pen test that SharePoint site. Ensure that you have updated patches. As a rule, we always stay, as Protiviti, at least one, if not two, cumulative updates behind. Mostly based on the effort it takes to put them in, but also based on we don't know what vulnerabilities have been created by the patch. So the patch needs to be out in the wild for a little bit before we put that onto our environments. And of course, learn to publish SharePoint correctly. The documentation is fantastic. It's out there on the Microsoft TechNet site, and there's stuff on MSDN about coding for SharePoint. Use the secure practices. I've put some resource links available in the slide deck for you. These are some blog posts that I've been working on, some series of securing SharePoint and attack surfaces. So please feel free to go and access those blogs and to use any of that content that's there. So I'm going to thank you for attending, and I'll open the time to questions and hand it back to Steve.
Great, thanks, Liam. And again, we'll open it up for questions. I do have one thing to add, Liam, because you touched on something that was kind of important when you went through and showed an example of something that showed up in a Google search results, which has since been locked down. That if for some reason you see something or you have something out there in Google that you need to remove, Google's got a nice interface for removing things from search results. If you use their webmaster tools, you have to log in, prove that you own the domain where that page lives, but you can actually go and remove it. So in the example that Liam showed, there was something out there that went to, I think it was to the, might have been to the DISP user, but when you clicked on it, you got the authentication, which means it was open at one point, they locked it down, and then they need to go back in and kind of remove it out of Google, and you can do that using their webmaster tools.
Cool.
And I'll give it another second. Liam, it doesn't look like I have any questions. So I think we can wrap up. We ran a couple minutes over, but appreciate everybody's time this afternoon. And Liam, appreciate your time. This is always great. And we'll see everybody in 2 weeks where we're going to talk about rich media and videos in SharePoint. Thanks, Liam. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Thank you.